Do you want to know how you can spark faith conversations with anyone? Well, you can read a book called Hollywood Heroes to discover how your favorite fictional characters like Iron Man, Batman, and others reveal truths about God. And that is what this episode is all about. Welcome to the Apologetics Guys Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity, and then helps you be able to turn around and explain your faith with both courage and compassion. I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at Moody Bible Institute. Well, I am so glad that you're here with me today because you are going to get some creative ideas for how to get into spiritual conversations with anyone and help people think through the big questions of life by using themes and ideas that we find in popular movies. Now, before I forget, I want to say a big thank you to NavPress for sponsoring this episode. And my guest on the show today is Frank Turek. Frank is the president of Cross Examined and the author of a book called Hollywood Heroes. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Hey, Mikel, thanks for having me on. And I got to give equal billing to my son, Zach, who also wrote the book with me. Mm-hmm. He's excited about it, as you can imagine.
Well, that's awesome. You actually got a copy of this book in a nice, cool little box from NavPress with all the goodies in it. There was popcorn, there was some candy in it. And I was in Dallas, took the book on the plane, and I'm here now in Chicago doing the interview with you. So I'm so glad that we got to sit down and do this.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Well, before we dive into our discussion, can you tell us the story about how this book came about? You mentioned you wrote it with your son. How'd that happen?
Well, my son has loved movies his whole life, particularly these superhero movies. Mm-hmm. And we're just talking about the plots of these movies. And we realized that so many of these movies and these characters are borrowing from the greatest story ever told, the story, of course, of Jesus. And we point out in the book how these superhero movies such as Iron Man and Batman and Wonder Woman and Captain America, they all have heroes in them that really reflect the ultimate hero. And just like in the real world, we hope to be taken away from this world of pain and suffering to a place of bliss. That's what happens in these movies. Someone does come in and save them. They normally have to sacrifice themselves, these heroes do, or get involved in some sort of sacrifice to save people who are in danger. And of course, that's what the story of Christianity is, that somebody from outside this world comes into it and saves us from danger, saves us from ourselves, and will ultimately take us to a place of bliss. And I think that's why so many of these stories resonate, Mikel. They resonate with us because we naturally want to be taken to this place of bliss, and we know we can't get there ourselves. Somebody's got to rescue us.
Yeah, you don't often hear a lot about kind of literary apologetics. It's not just all philosophy. And this is a really cool way to actually engage people where they're at, because who doesn't love a good movie, and who hasn't seen, the summer blockbusters with all of these superhero movies. In fact, I remember seeing a DC Comics book called Mythology, and it was just a bunch of art, Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman art. And it is kind of like the Greek myths of old, I suppose, for our modern culture. Talk about, in the book, you mentioned the C.S. Lewis quote about Christianity being the true myth. What does that mean?
Well, Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, was a friend of C.S. Lewis before C.S. Lewis became a Christian. C.S. Lewis was an atheist for a while because he went through World War I and he thought there was too much injustice in the world, so there couldn't be a good God. And anyway, he, of course, later became a Christian. One of the ways he became a Christian was Tolkien would say to him, "Hey, Jack," that's what they called him, Jack. "Hey, Jack, why is it that you're thrilled with these dying and rising God stories?" Most of those came after Christianity, by the way, in fiction, but you're not enthralled with the same kind of story you read in the pages of the New Testament. He said, "You love all these myths, but Christianity is the true myth. In other words, it really happened." And Lewis checked into it from an apologetic standpoint and realized that Tolkien was right. And as you know, he probably became the most influential apologist of the 20th century, did C.S. Lewis, because Tolkien said, the myths that you love in fiction really came to life in history through Jesus. Jesus is the true myth.
Yeah, I love the story between those two beloved authors that a lot of people don't know about. And you talk about Lord of the Rings some in the book as well.
Oh, yeah. We have a chapter on Lord of the Rings as well. Yeah.
I think you're right that screenwriters have unconsciously perhaps brought these themes to life in what you could think of as these modern day modern myths in movies. And you're reading your book reminded me of something that missionaries like Don Richardson used to talk about, where he used to teach Christians to look for themes and concepts that are already there in the culture that have kind of prepared people for conversations about Jesus. But Frank, I'm curious if you had a certain group of people in mind when you wrote Hollywood Heroes. Were you thinking of a particular group?
Well, we were certainly thinking of teenagers that are interested in these movies, and adults are interested in them as well. But we wanted people that, maybe they haven't heard of Christianity very much, or they have, but they don't really know much about it. But they're enthralled with Iron Man, they're enthralled with Captain America, they're enthralled with Batman, whatever.
Well, yeah, I love all the Marvel characters that you decided to feature in the book. I've got a special place in my heart for Marvel because few people know, and I'm about to tell you, that I'm actually the first ever Christian apologist to ever be seen in the MCU, in the actual Marvel Cinematic Universe.
What were you in?
Now, how on earth did that happen? Quick story. I was actually an extra in the 2002 Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire. I actually hit him on the shoulder in an outtake, and I have the screenshot from the trailer to show the blurry guy who was behind him was actually me. But then, of course, that whole world became canon 20 years later in Spider-Man No Way Home by way of the multiverse.
Yes.
So I'm revealing big things on the show today as we celebrate this book about Hollywood heroes. So I love Marvel. Let's start with Captain America. All right. I love that you started the book with Captain America. What are some ways that Captain America's story brings up biblical themes that can then point us to Jesus?
Well, let's contrast, say, Captain America to Tony Stark, or Captain America to Iron Man, right?
Okay.
Tony Stark starts out as a billionaire, playboy, amoral arms dealer, right? He's the last guy you think is going to be a hero. He's all about himself, right? It's me, 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 give me this, give me that, right? But he's not happy. He's miserable, right? He has everything to live with and nothing to live for, okay? You go, though, to his colleague, Captain America. He's righteous from the very beginning. While he may be a scrawny kid who can't even enlist in the army in World War II, he's going to jump on a grenade for his buddies, right? He'll take the hit. And you never have to worry about Captain America or Steve Rogers doing the wrong thing. He's always going to do the right thing. You have to worry about Tony Stark, right? You don't know if he's going to do the right thing, but you know that Captain America is going to do the right thing. And of course, this is a parallel to Jesus, that Jesus always does the right thing. You never have to worry, is Jesus going to do the right thing or not? Steve Rogers, Captain America, is not perfect like Jesus is, but he is morally righteous. And so he doesn't need much character development. Tony Stark, on the other hand, he needs a lot of character development. And as you know, he ultimately does become a hero, because when you get to Endgame, spoiler alert, Tony Stark literally sacrifices himself to defeat the Satan figure Thanos and save the world. But you never would have thought that when you first were introduced to Tony Stark in the first Iron Man.
Yeah, I love how in the book you talk about how people, heroes, it's heroic to die for your friends, and how even Captain America not only jumped on the grenade, turned out to be a fake grenade, but still, but to go down with this plane to save people he didn't even know. That's like one more step. But then when you think about Jesus dying for his actual enemies, that's next level heroism.
Totally,
right? Like
next
nobody
level.
does that.
Yeah, that's why Jesus is the ultimate hero, because while Captain America will die for people he doesn't know, and many people will die for their friends, who's going to die for their enemies? Well, Jesus does.
That's amazing. So, I mean, think about it. It's Romans 5:8, right? This is the way God shows his love for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
Exactly.
John 3:16, and in this way, this is the way that God loved the world, that he sent his only son. He gave his only son for us, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. And the pagan gods, you'd be like, well, maybe we're in the good graces of the pagan gods because, our crops grow, or we're able to have kids or whatever. But this is the way that Christians know God loved the world. He gave his only son. Yeah. So
can we go back to something you said earlier? I want to make comment on. I think you said something about using stories to point people to Christianity, that this is exactly what Paul does on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. Now he's talking to unbelievers. He doesn't open the Old Testament. They don't believe the Old Testament. They might not even know it exists. When Paul goes into synagogues, he's quoting from the scriptures, right? The Old Testament scriptures. When he goes to Greece, he's not quoting the Old Testament. You know who he's quoting? He's quoting their own poets. He's quoting Greek poets. And the Greek poets would say, in Zeus, we live and move and have our being. And Paul comes along and he says, in Jesus, we live and move and have our being. So he applies the movies of their day to Christ. That's how he bridges to the gospel with unbelievers. And that's all we're doing in the book Hollywood Heroes. In fact, that's what Jesus did too. I know this is going to sound a little funny maybe to some of our listeners, but Jesus told stories that weren't true. They weren't true in history. Like, for example, he tells the Good Samaritan parable, right? If you were there with Jesus 2,000 years ago and he just told the parable and you were to ask him, hey, Jesus, this Good Samaritan, what's his name? He's not going to say his name was Bob, right? He's going to say, I don't think you're understanding the point of what I'm saying. I'm not saying these are stories in history. These are fictional stories that I've invented to communicate a theological or moral point. Right. Because stories communicate that quite often better than straight didactic teaching. And so Jesus used stories to communicate truths. And that's what we're doing in the book Hollywood Heroes. And I've seen some people object to what we're doing. I'm saying, well, if you're objecting to what we're doing, if you're saying that modern day stories can in some way point you back to the gospel, then you should say that both Jesus and Paul did it wrong, because that's exactly what they did.
Yeah. Let's go back to the Iron Man thing you were talking about, where he defeats Thanos. When Iron Man defeats Thanos, you said that he was kind of like a Satan figure. Thanos comes from the Greek word thanatos, which is death, and Jesus did in fact defeat death. It's a nice segue into the theological meaning of Jesus' crucifixion, because as Christians, we don't just believe things historically, we also believe things theologically as well. And so when we see, Jesus died on the cross, that's a historical thing you can talk about. What Jesus died for our sins, he defeated sin and death. That's a theological thing that we can discuss. And it's interesting how even these Hollywood movies can help us get there to that kind of conversation.
And Mikhail, I think that a lot of times this is unconscious in the screenwriters or the directors who put this together. Sometimes it's deliberate, but sometimes it's unconscious. They don't even know that they're using biblical themes. Here's one example that I love, that I think was completely unintended. They didn't take it from the Bible, but they could have. Do you know Iron Man in the first movie? He after he sells these weapons to these terrorists, one of the weapons blows up near Tony Stark, and it injures him. It puts shrapnel in his chest, and he has to have a device put into his chest to guard his heart from the encroaching shrapnel. If that device dies, or if that device fails, Tony Stark dies. Now, for me, this is a beautiful illustration of what I think is probably the second most important verse in the entire Bible now. The most important series of verses have to do with the gospel, but the second most important verse to our culture comes from the Old Testament. This is Proverbs 4:23, which says, above all else, guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. Doesn't say follow your heart. It says guard your heart. Now, here you have Tony Stark guarding his heart with this device. It's a visible device right in the middle of his chest. If that device fails, he dies. Now, Tony Stark goes from that point on a character development arc to where he goes from this selfish playboy who's following his heart to a hero who doesn't follow his heart. He follows the truth, and he ultimately sacrifices himself to save the world because he cares more about his family than he cares about his following his desires. Can you imagine, Mikhail, if we got to the end of Endgame? And now, by the way, I don't think that was intentional of the writer of Iron Man. I think it just worked out that way. But this is intentional at the end of Endgame. Imagine if Tony Stark saw Thanos in the final scene and said to his Avenger buddies, guys, I'm just not feeling it today. I don't want to take on Thanos. I got to get back to following my heart and taking care of just me. I'm out. And then the movie ended, right? There was no battle. Thanos wins. Would anybody go, wow, that was inspiring? No, everyone would go, that's awful. Now, the movie writers realize it would have been awful if he had done what the culture tells us to do. What does the culture tell us? Follow our hearts. Well, Tony Stark doesn't follow his heart. He follows the truth. He has courage to do what's right, and it's inspiring. It resonates with us. Well, if you like Tony Stark, if you like Iron Man, you're going to love Jesus, because Jesus does what's right, even though he doesn't want to do it, right? He doesn't want to go to the cross. Lord, if there's any way you can take this from me, take it from me. But if you can't, not my will, but yours.
So, Frank, now you've included other Hollywood heroes who are not in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like some DC characters. You mentioned Wonder Woman, Batman. Let's talk about Batman.
Sure.
The Dark Knight. Sometimes he's dark and super complicated, and sometimes he's just a caricature of himself, like in Lego Batman.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But how can talking about something like a Batman movie lead us into conversations about God?
Well, I think the Batman series presents the most realistic depiction of human nature in all the series, because Batman is fighting human nature. That's what he's fighting. Notice that Batman, first of all, always fights in the dark. You rarely see him in the light. Of course, Jesus said, men love darkness rather than light. You probably heard the saying, nothing good happens after midnight. All of the crimes are being committed at night. So Batman uses that as cover, and he's trying to strike fear into the criminals. But notice, Mikhail, he can never take a day off, Batman. He locks up criminals, and the next night he's got to do it again. He's never going to bring utopia to Gotham City by locking up criminals. He can't lock up enough people. If he locks up one, there's going to be another the next night that's still going to be out there, because human nature is evil. And the best he can do, just like law enforcement can do, is to restrain evil, not to eliminate it completely. And that's what most laws do, as you know, they restrain evil. Most laws are not trying to teach you to do good. They're trying to restrain people from doing evil. And Batman and the entire world around Batman is really about the sinfulness of human nature. And by the way, the sinfulness of human nature even corrupts Batman. You know, he starts becoming like the criminals he's fighting, right? He starts branding them. He starts brutalizing them, even though early on he didn't do it. And at one point in one of the movies, he basically is concerned that he might fall to the dark side, so to speak, to bring in a Star Wars metaphor here, right? He has plans, Batman does, to overpower any of the superheroes that go rogue. He even has plans to fight himself if he goes rogue. That's how much he realizes that human nature is corruptible.
One of my favorite ones was Batman versus Superman.
Yes.
Where you have the quote in the book where he talks about the problem of evil, essentially. Talk about that and how we can use that to get people to conversations about God.
Rarely. I know a lot of people didn't like Batman versus Superman. First of all, why is Batman fighting Superman, right? This doesn't make any sense. Well, here's why Batman is fighting Superman. Because Lex Luthor, the villain in this whole thing, believes that Superman is the god over this universe, and he's a bad god. Why is he a bad god? Because Superman did not prevent Lex Luthor's father from abusing Lex Luthor. So Lex Luthor's mad at Superman. He's a bad god, and he wants to basically kill the god of this universe. And he recruits Batman. He orients Batman in a way that Batman will try and take out Superman. That's where this comes from. And it's explicitly stated in the movie, this age-old problem that if there's a good God, why is there evil? I mean, this is what Lex Luthor actually says. And then, of course, he pits Batman against Superman. But notice, obviously, you can, if you go to this movie, or you watch this movie with somebody, you can start unpacking that issue, which we do in the book. Evil does not disprove God, as Lex Luthor seems to think. because evil wouldn't even exist if good existed, and good wouldn't exist unless God existed. So evil doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God. And the interesting thing about this whole thing is, notice that Lex Luthor, and we point this out in the book Hollywood Heroes, notice that Lex Luthor is mad at God for not stopping his father from abusing Lex Luthor. But Lex Luthor is not mad that God hasn't stopped him from doing evil to other people. Do you notice that when we complain about evil, we always complain about somebody else doing it? We always say, hey, God, why don't you stop him? Or God, why don't you stop her? We never say, God, why don't you stop me from doing evil? I always ask people, if God were to stop evil at midnight tonight, would you still be alive at 12:01? Because I wouldn't be. Because we do evil every day. God allows evil because he allows free will. Why does he allow free will? So this is a moral universe. We can choose to love, but we can also use our free will to do evil. And ultimately, God is not going to take away our free will. What he's ultimately going to do about evil is going to quarantine it in a place called hell, where people will still have free will, but they'll be quarantined. They'll be walled off from the people who have accepted the free gift of salvation. So God has a plan ultimately, and the only way we could get out of the evil we've done is have someone else pay for that punishment himself, and that would be Jesus himself.
Yeah, the whole idea of good versus evil, it's so universal, but at its foundation, evil requires good, because you can imagine a world where nothing falls short of a standard, but you can't have something that falls short of the standard without a standard.
That's right.
And so there has to be an objective standard of good for there even to be a story about good versus evil. And then, of course, we see in the Batman movies that we can't defeat sin. Sin is undefeatable by humans. And that's why God's the only one who can defeat evil. It's something, you assemble all the heroes in the entire world and we still cannot defeat sin, because that's not something humans can do.
No, we can't. That's why we need a savior. We need somebody, a superhero from outside, the ultimate hero who's perfect and can take our punishment on himself to save us. And that's what Jesus does. That's what all these stories ultimately point to. And this is a great way, by the way, then to get your young person, your child, your grandchild, who might not be interested in Christianity, to get them interested in it by watching movies with them. I mean, can you imagine how much fun it would be to have movie night? You read a chapter of Hollywood Heroes and you say, okay, well, now we're gonna watch these movies and we'll talk about them when we're done. That's a way to get people engaged and at least move them a step closer to Jesus, if not all the way there.
Yeah, you mentioned Wonder Woman earlier. Let's talk about the idea of truth in the Wonder Woman movies, because I really like that part in the book as well. How does Wonder Woman's story help us get to conversations about truth? Wonder
Woman has two superpowers: truth and love. Gee, that's unusual for a superhero, right? I mean, she's got the lasso of truth.
At least it's not I'm rich.
That's right. Yeah, that's a Bruce Wayne. What's your superpower? I'm rich.
Just as an aside, by the way, Wonder Woman, Princess Diana, is actually Artemis of the Ephesians, if you look into who Diana is in mythology. But that's
exactly. No,
totally
you're right.
Yeah,
we point that out, that she's Diana and her brother is Ares, and she fights Ares in the first Wonder Woman movie. But she uses the lasso of truth, and she also uses love. In fact, in the second Wonder Woman movie, Wonder Woman 1984, the villain is a guy by the name of Max Lord. I don't have time to tell you the whole plot, but basically he's almost like a prosperity gospel preacher, and he's causing the world to disintegrate to the point where it's about to go to nuclear war. And at the end of the movie, Wonder Woman does not overpower him through physical strength. She overpowers him with the truth. And she talks about following the truth. And he ultimately repents of what he's doing, and the whole disaster is averted. So she doesn't follow her heart either, by the way. In the movie, if she tries to, in order for her to defeat the evil Max Lord, she has to give up her one desire, and that is her boyfriend, Steve Trevor. The way the plot works out, if she doesn't let him go, she can't save the world. She doesn't want to let him go, but she knows the truth is she has to let him go to save the world. She doesn't follow her heart, she follows the truth. This is a countercultural message. Wonder Woman gives a countercultural message, just like Iron Man does. You don't follow your heart, you follow the truth. Now, we need that message because about 91%, I saw a recent survey the other day, Mikhail, 91% of people think that the meaning of life and the purpose of life is to do what you desire, to follow your heart. And there couldn't be worse advice to follow your heart without moral restraint. Now, if you're following your heart and it's moral and it's right, okay, that's one thing. But many times we're following our heart and it's immoral. We shouldn't be doing that.
And the Bible right out says, Jesus says, out of the heart comes false testimony, right? So that's a biblical principle.
And the heart is deceitful and wicked. Who can know it, said Jeremiah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So as I said earlier, you don't just talk about superheroes. And so I want to cover at least one of those. You talked about Star Wars. So let's think about Star Wars. I actually just finished watching Obi-Wan Kenobi on Disney Plus, and it reminded me of the story arc of Anakin Skywalker that you talk about. How can talking about the story of Anakin Skywalker and how he became Darth Vader, how can that lead us into some spiritual conversations?
Yeah, because the Anakin Skywalker slide into Darth Vader is a slide of sin. He's enticed and dragged away, as James says, the half-brother of Jesus, wrote that little book in the New Testament called James. He says that's what brings us into sin, that we're enticed and dragged away by our own desires. And that's what happens to Anakin. He starts out as the hope, right? The hope for the Jedis. And before you know it, instead of being the hope of the Jedis, he's actually succumbed to his own desires, which are he wants to maintain his power. He wants to make sure his family's okay. And a Sith Lord guarantees he'll be able to do that for him. So he gives in to the Sith Lord, and then he becomes Darth Vader. He slides into sin one step at a time. And in the book Hollywood Heroes, we go and show you how he does this. And that's exactly what happens to us. In fact, George Lucas, who, as you know, was not a Christian, but he had some Christian themes in this movie, actually says that when Anakin Skywalker gave in to the Sith Lord, who would later become the Emperor of the Empire, he said, this is where Anakin succumbed to the devil. That's what George Lucas said.
Yeah, and there's the whole redemption side too that you talk about with Darth Vader at the end, where he kind of becomes a tragic hero, if you would. So in some sense, he is a Hollywood hero as well. Talk about that redemption side.
Darth Vader finally, at the last moment, just when it looks like Luke is going to be killed by the Emperor, he throws the Emperor down that shaft and is mortally wounded in the process. And then Darth Vader is drugged out of that area by Luke, his son. Spoiler alert. And if you don't know that Luke is Darth Vader's son by now, sorry. It's been 45 years. Anyway, so he takes off, Luke takes off Darth Vader's helmet, and Luke says to him, I have to save you, Father. And of course, Darth Vader says, you've already done that, son. I'm already saved. And go tell your sister you were right, or she was right. He dies there, but he's saved by his son. And then, of course, you see them a little bit later. They're transfigured. Darth Vader is transfigured with Alec Guinness and Yoda in a scene that I think obviously mirrors the transfiguration of the New Testament. So there's an afterlife in the Star Wars series as well. Now, obviously, there are some differences we're not redeemed by our good works. We're redeemed by the grace of the work of Jesus. But you see the story of redemption in Star Wars, just like you see it in the greatest story ever told.
Yeah, just like the Apostle Paul, who had blood on his hands, right? Nobody's too far gone for redemption. It's possible, but in the real world, we can't do that on our own, just like we can't stop sin on our own.
We treat everyone as if they are redeemable. And even some people, you go, oh, that person would never come to Christ. You learn later they did. You go, wow, how can that be? Because God loves us more than we love ourselves.
Well, now you finish up the book by saying that Jesus is the ultimate hero, and we've been saying that throughout our discussion today. I like how you mentioned that Jesus is full of grace and truth. Talk about that aspect of Jesus as the ultimate hero.
Yeah, this is one thing that struck me in researching this, that Jesus is a unique character in all of history, regardless of whether or not you think he's God. Because when you look at Jesus, he holds two characteristics in tension, several different sets of characteristics. He's 100% truth and 100% grace at the same time. He's 100% mission focused, but he's also loving, 100% loving at the same time. These seem to be opposed. I know, like, I'm a very task oriented person. A lot of times I'll blow right by people that might need me because I got a goal, right? I'm not people focused if I'm mission focused, right? And some people are so people focused, they're not mission focused, right? He is 100% confident and yet 100% humble at the same time. He's full of moral principles and yet he's completely approachable at the same time. Usually we come down on one side or the other. We're either legalists or we're complete libertarians, right? We can't seem to hold the tension together. We're either moralists or we're laissez-faire people. Do whatever you want, right? Jesus somehow is both at the same time. He's both full of moral principles and yet he's approachable at the same time, full of grace. And I don't see that. I don't see those sets of characteristics held in any other individual in fiction or nonfiction in all of history. And it strains credulity to think that these fishermen, that these disciples, that these uneducated people, most of them were uneducated, Luke was, but most of them were uneducated, that they could create a character like this that has never been created in all of history or in all of fiction, that they could do this and pull it off and make it seem authentic. They didn't pull it off and make it was authentic. He's a real person. He really existed. He's the ultimate hero.
Yeah. Reading this section, it reminds me of John Dixon, who once said that the genius of Jesus is that he can flex two muscles at the same time, the muscle of conviction and the muscle of compassion. Because Jesus didn't back down from the truth. No way. But he loved people well. He was teaching truth and he loved people well. And that's something we need to emulate in the way we do our apologetics and our cultural engagement.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's well said.
So as we land the plane here, I think one thing that's come out of our conversation today is when we watch movies, we need to pay attention to these kinds of themes, to the big questions of life that come up in these Hollywood movies, because there's universal longings there that we can see in the stories. And these things, the gospel actually speaks into these spaces. And so these Hollywood heroes can sometimes make a creative segue into some meaningful spiritual conversations with your friends who don't see Christianity the same way you do, or maybe even your own kids. So pay attention to the culture, pay attention to these characters, because they may help in spiritual conversations get people to conversations about the gospel. Frank, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we end
one
here?
other thing, my son and I, who, as I say, co-wrote the book, we have a website called HollywoodHeroesBook.com. So if you want to see more about the book before you get it, or you want to see if you want to get it, check out HollywoodHeroesBook.com. And also, we have a podcast called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And we've done 2 or 3 shows on this. So if you want to go further into it, go to the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast and check it out there.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank, for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thanks again to Nav Press for sponsoring this episode. They're actually offering everyone who's tuned into the show today 30% off the book Hollywood Heroes if you use the coupon code podcast, all caps, on their website. So I'll drop a link in the description so that you can check that out, put it in the show notes as well. Now, if you're one of our audio listeners, one new thing that I'm doing on the show is reading the reviews that you leave on Apple Podcasts. And today's featured review comes from Mayor Black, who says, Dr. Mikel Del Rosario is one of my favorite apologists. As you watch his videos on YouTube or listen to his podcasts, Mikel's passion for answering difficult questions pertaining to Christianity is refreshingly apparent, and his interviewing style is humble, respectful, and engaging. Most certainly check out The Apologetics Guy. Well, thank you, Mayor Black, so much for your kind comments and for leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And for all of you listening to this, please do take a moment to leave a review on Apple Podcasts for the show. It really does help more people discover what we're doing here, and it's super important for newish podcasts just like this one. So thanks again for joining us today and joining our #First Friday habit here on the Apologetics Guys show. I appreciate you being part of our podcast community. And speaking of our podcast community, one last thing I want to say before I go today is I want to shout out my new friend, Rob, who's actually one of our subscribers on YouTube. And he helped save today's episode by going out of his way to get me an Apple dongle that somehow got lost during my move from Dallas to Chicago. So thank you, Rob. As always, I'm your apologetics guy, Mikkel, and until next time, keep the faith. Hollywood Heroes will help you see how modern-day parables in Batman, Wonder Woman, Star Wars, and others reveal truths about God. And you can get 30% off your copy at navpress.org/Hollywood-Heroes. Just use the promo code podcast.